to interview a doctorate, psychologist, and international bestseller. What a treat! I'm Kim, the content marketing specialist for Veterinary. In today's episode, I speak to Nadine Hamilton, and I've already introduced who she is and what she does. But for you, it's important to know that she's the founder of Positive Psyche Solutions and also the founder of Love Your Pet, Love Your Vet, a charity dedicated to mental health for the veterinary profession. We speak about managing expectations and setting healthy boundaries, and we look at things like ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. Nadine gives us real-life examples of how you can navigate the tricky landscapes of veterinary life, look at how you can incorporate assertiveness and be able to set boundaries, especially when many of us can find it difficult due to people-pleasing or being a perfectionist. It is still okay to have high standards, she reminds us, but we can be realistic about it and cope in more effective ways. Nadine uses well-researched, evidence-based coping strategies, so it really does pay to listen to her, especially with her warm and bubbly energy. Let's dive in. Hi Nadine, how are you doing today?
Hello, really well, thank you.
Welcome to Pause, Rewind and Play. This is really exciting. We had a bit of a chat beforehand, and we know that you've worked with Veterinary before. You are a psychologist, leading authority on veterinary wellbeing. You have a doctorate degree. You founded a charity called Love Your Pet, Love Your Vet. And you do have a best-selling book about coping with stress and burnout as a vet. So you've got a whole lot of experience there, and you do indeed specialize in veterinary mental health and wellbeing. What's your story? How did you get into this in the first place?
Well, I guess from as far back as I can remember, like many people, I wanted to be a vet. So I've always had a love of animals and thought, yeah, I'll be a vet. And one day in my very, very early teens, I was at the vet with my guinea pig, and the vet happened to be the father of one of my school friends. And I remember sitting in the waiting room and thinking, I couldn't do this job. You know, they've got to operate on animals. I'm super queasy. And then I thought, and what happens when they have to put them to sleep? Like, I couldn't cope with that, obviously, because we were, facing that dilemma ourselves. And so I just continued talking too much at school, dropped out of high school at 15, no school qualifications, but just always felt that something was missing. Like, I knew that there was a purpose, but I just didn't know what that purpose was. So I had a lot of different jobs, worked in the mailroom was my very first job, got promoted. I worked in administrative positions, worked my way up to like executive assistant, PA jobs, managed offices, all that sort of stuff. But I'm like, something's missing. I want to study something. So very long story short, I realised that it was psychology that I wanted to study. Yeah. I applied to university, got accepted as a mature age student, and was at my first residential school. And it was probably a week or two before that one of my cousins in the UK took his life. And that was sort of a really pivotal moment, because I knew, oh my gosh, what's going on for him? Obviously as a budding psychologist, and then finding out, one of my own cousins had taken their life, it was like, okay, we have to do something about this. And so one of the professors I spoke to said, you'll focus on probably 20 other things during your university time, and you won't want to specialise in this, or, well, we're not allowed to say specialise in psychology, but we're not allowed to, I wouldn't have that expertise, I guess, in that area. And so he was sort of right. I focused on organisational psychology, like training, development, but still always felt something was missing. So I worked in, got my full registration, so I did my internship, all of that. And I was at the vet one day, and there was a locum vet there who I'd never met before. I've never met her since. And she asked me what I did for a job, and I told her I was a psychologist. And she said to me, so you'd be aware of the really high suicide rate in vets? And I said, no, I wasn't aware of that. And that was pretty much like the second aha moment that I had, where I was like, wow, okay, I want to do something in suicide prevention. My cousin Andrew wasn't a vet, but nevertheless, a suicide's still a suicide. Yeah. And then it was sort of like my love for the vet profession. I was like, okay, I can indirectly help the animals by helping the people who care for the animals. So it was sort of like a win-win in my way, because I'm like, I don't have to do the gory, traumatic stuff, even though I guess a lot of what I do is dealing with trauma, but it's just without all the blood and guts and that sort of stuff, the queasy kind of stuff. And so that was what started my doctoral research. And I researched that. I looked into why vets have such a high rate of burnout and suicide, but also what we can do about it. So I developed a program, a wellbeing program, to see if that would make a difference and help the vets in their day-to-day life as well as in their practice life. And it was effective. It was statistically significant, which was awesome. And so once I finished my doctorate, I was sort of like, oh, okay, now what? I hit a brick wall professionally, because I knew that the industry needed support, but people wouldn't reach out for it. And I'm like, okay, have I just, wasted 6.5 years doing this research? And I knew I didn't, but I was like, well, what do I do? The people in this profession, they don't want to do anything. So I worked a year in academia. And long story short, I spoke with the marketing and business coach that I'd worked with before. And I said, oh, look, I have to create a paradigm shift in this profession. And she's the genius behind it. She said, oh, we need a campaign, something like love your pet, love your vet. So that's sort of how that really came to fruition. Yeah. It is. And I can't take the credit for coming up with the name of that or the campaign idea. And that was when I partnered with Royal Canin here in Australia. We launched the first campaign in 2018, published the book 2019, and then we did our second campaign last year. We finally got that out. So there's a lot happening in my spare time. No, just kidding.
I'll go though. It really sounds like there was a lot of experimentation, and then you found your niche. And as you said, there was that pivotal moment with your cousin, and then obviously meeting a local vet, which feels like it was synchronistic in some ways.
Absolutely. But,
it's almost like it was your calling to go and do this and fill a gap in the market, which is there's plenty of assistance in mental health, but if there's one industry or a set of professionals that need that help and focus and spotlight on it, and then that's where you came in. And I'm sure many people are grateful for your service and contribution.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes.
So we wanted this episode to be about managing expectations and setting healthy boundaries. I think a lot of guests that we've had on our podcast before, we've spoken about mental health quite a lot. And I think what we find is that it's really easy for us we understand what we need to do. We know we need to prioritize ourselves and eat healthily and exercise more and say no and empower yourself. But it's not, taking action is a different thing too. Yes. So I want to ask you, like, what kind of expectations might vets encounter on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. And I think that's a really good question, because unrealistic expectations was actually one of the top 5 contributors to the high rate of suicide that came out of my research. And it's twofold. There's the unrealistic expectations that other people put on the vets. So whether that's their client, their co-workers, their family, their friends, just these expectations that they can fix everything. They can perform miracles, even if the animal has little compatibility with life. There's still this expectation, oh, but I watched it on the TV and you performed a miracle, so I expect you to do that for myself. So those expectations from other people, oh, it's okay, we'll just fit another consult and you'll be right because you did it yesterday. All those sorts of things, and those pressures all start to mount up. But there's also the unrealistic expectations that they place on themselves. Like, they can't ask for help. They have to have all the answers. They can't make mistakes because that might mean that they're not perfect or they're not the best of the best. Many of them deal with imposter syndrome as well. So, feeling like they're not good enough or feeling like phonies in the profession despite having the qualifications and quite often the experience to go with it. So 70% of people will have imposter syndrome, but it's those kind of expectations as well. So they're putting the pressure on themselves as well as the expectations that other people are putting on them. So it's a double whammy with that one.
Yeah. And how do you think that they could distinguish or try and at least realize the difference between, okay, this is unrealistic, and then how do you get to managing that?
So I think too, like being aware of it, because sometimes it's like if they're seeking perfection, perfection doesn't exist. It's sort of like saying what's happy or what's normal, because we all have a different idea of what perfect is and what happiness is to us, what normal is to us. So when we're looking at from a vet perspective, it's looking and saying, okay, can I realistically meet this expectation? Is it realistic to think that I can perform 2 surgeries simultaneously because I've got 2 emergencies that have come through the door?
Yeah.
No, it's not. So if they're trying to go, well, I could do this and do this, it's just not realistic. So sometimes it's taking a step back and looking at it and thinking, what pressure is this putting on me to be able to try and achieve what it is that I'm trying to achieve? Is it actually realistic to think that I can accomplish this? What would I say if this was a colleague and I was watching a colleague doing exactly what I'm trying to do? Would I sort of say to them, look, you can't do everything. You can't be everything for everyone. Would I look at that and respond differently? Or would I have those expectations? Well, if I can do it, you should be able to do it too. So it's, I think, being more realistic, being open to the fact that, as I said, there's no such thing as perfection. Perfectionism doesn't exist. And so I'm not saying it's not okay to have high expectations, but they need to be realistic expectations. And, that's where obviously a lot of the smart goal setting or those smart, whether they're resolutions or whatever they might be, come into play, that they need to be achievable, they need to be realistic. And how do we measure all of that? So I think it's stepping back and sort of saying, you know what, I can't possibly have all the answers. Even though I feel like I should, I can't, and I get it. Myself as a professional, of course, I want to have all the answers. I want to be able to fix everything. The reality is I can't do that. So I need to be realistic and say, you know what, I can only do what I can do. I can seek the support and I can seek help and guidance from other people to help with that. But there's a point where I have to say I can't do everything on my own.
Yeah.
Which it's not easy, but sometimes we have to, because what's the alternative if we don't do that?
Yeah, and I think there's a level of sort of introspection there where at the end of the working day you might be reflecting back on the day and just trying to understand what was realistic, what wasn't realistic, what was helpful, not helpful. And, mistakes are one of the recurring themes that come up. And I had that conversation with my last guest, Danny the vet. And he, he's got a decade or more of experience, he's quite senior, but he put forth good advice, which was, when you get home every day, try and compartmentalize things, because you are not responsible for fixing everything, as you said, for every single problem. And there is no such thing as perfection. So your system literally can't be on the fight or flight all day long. And when you get home in the evening, you do have to relax at some point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. Because when you are fired and you are in that fight-flight response, I mean, your cortisol, your adrenaline is pumping. We're not designed to be in that state permanently. Like worst case scenario, stress can kill, and you don't want to be in that, because then the cortisol leads to all sorts of other problems as well. And you've got adrenal issues and, it's sort of like, okay, how do we switch off? And I think part of that, I like Danny's way of sort of handling it and compartmentalizing it. But I think also it comes into being able to accept the reality of what is. And, I use a lot of different strategies. I think perhaps one of my favorite is acceptance and commitment therapy, which is about accepting the things you can't change or control, but then committing to act or respond in a manner that's consistent with your values. Because when you're going over everything, I should have said this, I should have done that, if only I'd have done this, you just racking yourself up inside, creating more and more stress for something that's not going to change. And, that's where it's sort of like, okay, I need to accept the reality of that. Often we just avoid it and push it under the carpet because that's easier. But it's like, does it change the fact that it happened? No. And so, being able to accept and acknowledge the reality of what's happened, I think is a big part of that, having evidence-based coping strategies to be able to deal with the demands of everyday life. We're all dealing with things. There's always something that we wish we could change or, do differently, wish things hadn't happened. But, the reality is it has, for those things that have happened, and is worrying about it and stressing about it going to change that reality? Absolutely not. It just makes you feel worse.
Yeah, it's not useful. And actually, I find that the ACT modality is useful for every aspect of life, professionally and personally, because you can pretty much apply it to every scenario, which is like just having a mini talk with yourself. Is this, like you said, can I change this? If not, there's no point in worrying and stressing about it, because it just.
So what can I control?
Yeah, that it has that grip on you, and if you won't let go, it's not going to let go of you.
Exactly. And then the more you avoid things, the worse it tends to get. It's like if you have time off from work because there's conflict, or you're feeling burnt out, so you have some time off on holidays or sick leave, the thought of going back sometimes can make go, oh, I don't want to go back there. And then the longer it is, the worse it gets, because it just builds and builds and builds and builds. Sometimes that's not the healthy way to do it. I mean, if you're burnt out, I wouldn't say, yes, go running back to work. But if you feel sick at the thought of going into work, there's something going on with that, and you need to take that seriously. And that's what I love with the ACT, because it puts us in control of our behaviour, which is the only thing that is within our control. We can't control other people or situations or circumstances. We can only control how we respond to them. So if we're doing that in line with our values are the things that give us our sense of meaning and purpose, the things we want to stand for. So and
which even just hearing that alone can lift you up. It can lighten you up a little, and it makes you feel like you have more power within yourself.
Definitely.
Do you think that, in committing to keeping this short and bite-sized, do you think that this, as our last question, that this paves the way for boundaries? Like what does a boundary look like, and how can we set them? How can we commit to setting them?
To setting them, sure. So think about your boundaries as like your fence line, whether it's your property line at home, whether it's the property line in the workplace or your neighbours or whatever. You have that, whether it's a physical fence or a wall, you have something around you. So imagine that you have those boundaries around yourself, and it's then deciding, okay, who or what do you want to allow in to come into your space? Certain situations, you're like, you know what? No, I'm going to keep them at an arm's length. They're not coming in. I'm not going to let them in here. I might talk to them or communicate with them in some other way, but I don't have to let them in here. So boundaries, they're those sort of things where we need to say, what are we prepared to accept and what aren't we prepared to accept? Who are we prepared to accept things from, and who aren't we prepared to accept things from? So as an example, it might be, yes, I'm, very open to having a hug, but if it was a complete stranger that ran up to me in the shopping centre car park at 9 o'clock at night and said, can I have a hug? The boundaries are like, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Like, back off. Yeah. But if it was, a friend that I hadn't seen for a long time, they're like, oh my gosh, how are you? And then it's like, so I'm deciding who I'm going to let in and who is not coming in. And I've seen people freak out when I talk about setting boundaries, because they're like, but that usually means conflict. And it doesn't have to. If you do it assertively and set those boundaries, it's also, I guess, talking about or thinking about, are you prepared to bend those boundaries a little or extend those boundaries? So it could be, and we were actually just talking about this yesterday on a webinar. If somebody said to you, look, could you do, I guess we haven't got time zone stuff, could you do a webinar? It will be this time in the evening for you. It's like, sure, I'm happy to be flexible. If you had said, but we need you to do it at 2 a.m. in the morning, okay, I'd have to have a boundary and say, I'll be no use to anyone at 2 o'clock in the morning. That's probably a little, I have got up at 5 a.m. before and done a 5:30 a.m. webinar for the UK. That was probably the earliest. Again, it's having those boundaries. So because somebody asked the question about what's the difference between being flexible and having boundaries, but it's knowing what you're comfortable doing. If you're comfortable saying, yeah, I'm okay to do this, this is my choice, without feeling bad about it or anything like that, that's setting a healthy boundary. But if people are giving into that, or you're letting people come into that space and you're like, oh, I wish they'd just back off, I'm really not happy with this, that's not okay. That's not a healthy boundary. Or if you're always giving in to people, in those situations. So yeah, it's, I guess, identifying your boundaries. What are the things you're prepared to have and allow into your space, and who and what aren't, and then being assertive enough to then reinforce those boundaries. It's sort of like before you build a fence in your house, it's like, yep, I've got my little sticks here or pegs here showing my boundary line, but if people are still walking across, okay, I might need to put a fence up. I'm reinforcing that boundary. So, it's those sorts of things to be able to reinforce them.
Yeah. Can I ask, what if somebody is a massive people pleaser? What if they're scared to disappoint others? Because we get that often.
Yeah, definitely. It still comes back to assertiveness, and then what's going to be the repercussion or the consequence if you don't. And so it's, again, having those coping strategies, because yes, of course, we don't want to get into conflict. We don't want people to not like us or to think that we're not good enough or whatever it may be that we're struggling with. But if we keep giving in, we're sending the wrong message. We're sending that message to that person that they can treat us however they want, and we're just going to take it. And that's not okay. So I would always suggest, starting with assertive communication. So those I statements rather than you statements, which are accusatory. So I would appreciate it if you could please not ring me after 9 o'clock at night, because that's when I go to bed and it wakes me up. I'm happy to take your call up until 8:30, but not after 9 o'clock. Or I would appreciate it if you could please just stop swearing at me. I'm happy to have a conversation with you, but not while you're swearing at me. Yeah. Those sorts of things. I mean, there's so many different scenarios that you could use.
I think that's a really good tactic, well worth remembering, though, just in the language of I, because as you say, it's not accusatory. It brings the power back to you. But yes, as you say, I'm sure there's many strategies, and it's really great to hear from you. But one of the most powerful ones.
Yes. Assertiveness and coping strategies and boundaries. That would be probably the top three.
Yeah, exactly. So Nadine, I think that's all the questions that I have for you today. But I do feel really blessed because even though this conversation is about mental health for vets, I feel like I've had my own therapy session with a psychologist all the way from Australia to someone sitting in Edinburgh. So thank you. It's not often that
you're welcome.
Encounter professionals and best-selling authors and the leading authority on these types of things. So I'm sure our listeners will be very happy to tune in and get access to this kind of wisdom and advice.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me on too, and helping to spread the word and get that support out there as well. It's very encouraging to see organisations taking a proactive response for the veterinary profession. So thank you too.
Very welcome. Whoosh, I just feel like I had my own therapy session there. After 30 minutes of chatting to Nadine, I myself feel a little bit lighter. And I hope that after listening to her, you found her advice useful. It's hard not to take the words with credibility, especially with Nadine being a doctorate psychologist and best-selling author of How to Cope with Burnout and Stress as a veterinarian. I really did love hearing the analogy of thinking of your home and a fence when it comes to setting boundaries. So it's up to you on who you let in and who's not coming in, and just really thinking of a safe space. Up next, we have our podcast interview with Anthony Chadwick, and he is the CEO of the Webinar Vet. So also a little bit more education about the importance of continued professional development. Stay tuned.